about that.
Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and I wanted to record a little bit of an introduction here before this video about orphans and characters without parents in children's literature. Because the video that I had for this was part of there was 3 sections in the video, and I'm gonna attempt to try to pull out the one about orphans, and so some of the stuff at the beginning doesn't apply to you, so I'm gonna try to cut it out, and then I'm gonna um, have a little bit of it cuts off at the end, so I'll have another little thing where I say goodbye at the end. So this is the video about um, characters without parents. Characters without parents. Some of the characters in the books that I'm going to talk about have been adopted, um, for better or for worse, maybe by a family member, an aunt or an uncle, sometimes nice, sometimes evil. Right. So there's several books that I'll mention. So, um, since we're not having a video of the week whenever we do adoption as one of our themes, I'll just do both of them on this video, and so that'll work fine. There are some books that I didn't mention, like classic stories like Cinderella, who's sort of the classic orphan. I didn't mention her because we talked about her a little bit during our fairy tale unit. And I didn't mention some of the books we read in class this week. Pippi Longstocking, for one. Pippi Longstocking is an orphan which we read for class this week. Also, the Boxcar Children. I didn't mention those because didn't have these books yet back when I recorded this video some months ago. So I wanted to add those in. That those are some other uh, sort of well-known famous orphans in children's literature, in addition to the ones I'm about to talk about. So I'll turn it over to me from a few months ago, and you can watch and look at some of the different types of orphans and characters without parents. And then I'll see you again at the end of the video. Bye.
So let's talk about um, children without parents. So you do have books about kids who are homeless who do have parents. Like a homeless family. That is not as common. Actually, being an orphan is pretty common in children's literature. It especially children's adventure fiction or fantasy. If there's something dire or important happening in a young person's world, if they have parents, the parents are going to be the ones who are in charge. The parents are going to be the ones who step in. Um, to be able to have the child character emerge and sort of step forward and take on their role as sort of the hero of the story, the parents have to be either absent or ineffectual in some way. Think of, say, Stranger Things. The kids all have parents, but their parents are completely clueless about what's going on, except for Will's mom, obviously, Winona Ryder's character. But they all have parents who are like, "You want to play? Okay, have fun." Like they're completely absent from the situation. So sometimes you have, in children's books, you have kids who are in charge of important things because the adults in their lives aren't paying attention. But a lot of times, the easiest way to make a kid be in charge or to step forward as a hero is to make them be an orphan or to be on their own for some reason. And so there's sort of this long tradition in children's literature of having no parents. It's just kind of a thing. It's not that unusual. Probably one of the earliest. We don't have it's not a children's book, but even with Dickens, with like Oliver Twist, the famous "Please sir, can I have some more?" Like the famous orphan and his plight. Great Expectations, also Dickens. He was really had a heart for orphans and young children. So I have a collection of some books of sort of well known orphans throughout children's literary history. The earliest one I have, y'all are gonna laugh right out the gate, but it's called Ragged Dick. So just I'll wait. Get it out of your system. Okay, so it's Horatio Alger, and he actually wrote a lot of books about street children in London, and New York. This one is set in New York, but like he had a lot of books about like New York and cities, like kids in the city and like scrappy kids. So Ragged Dick is actually set in New York, and that's the name of the character. That's what he goes by. His name's Richard, but people who named Richard used to go by Dick. And so he was a boot black. So, like on the streets, this came out in 1868. Yeah, 1868. And so in the 19th century, in the 1800s, businessmen on the street, all along there were young boys with like a wood box and a crate, a case of shoe shine, and would shine their shoes of the businessmen, right? And they would get tips, and it was mostly homeless boys running around doing that. And that's what Ragged Dick, he was a boot black. If you recall, Dickens, if you remember what we talked about him, he worked in a blacking factory where they made the stuff, the blacking that goes on boots. So that's kind of a small world. But this is it's a coming of age novel with, basically he pulls himself up by his bootstraps, not, pun intended. And he sort of makes something of himself and is able to build up enough money to have an apartment, and he goes to Sunday school and learns to read, and it's this great rags to riches story. But it's one of the earliest examples I have from the mid 1860s of this sort of orphan makes good kind of a novel. But it's certainly not the only one. It's just, in my collection, it's the earliest one I have, and it's a good example of the kind of stories that there used to be. Another one we've already read a little bit of, Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer was an orphan. He lives with his Aunt Polly, if you recall. So he was adopted by a family member. That's pretty common. But he didn't have parents, so to speak. Another sort of domestic situation, and this is Huckleberry Finn. His father was abusive, and he was an abusive drunk, and so that was he was practically an orphan because the only parent he had was an abusive drunk. So both of the boys in Twain's classic Tom Sawyer are without parents. Aunt Polly tries to be his parent, but he considers himself to be, without authority. So Tom Sawyer is another famous orphan. We have Wizard of Oz, which we've already read. Dorothy is an orphan. She lives with her aunt and uncle. So she's been adopted by members of the family. So that's, another sort of reality of the time. Just to keep us on our timeline, Ragged Dick was 1868. Tom Sawyer was 1871. This is 1900. So we're kind of skipping along here. Another example from 1903, if you've ever read or seen the movie A Little Princess, the Shirley Temple movie is probably the most well-known version of A Little Princess, but Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote it. She also wrote The Secret Garden, so if you're familiar with that story, which also has orphans in it, now that I'm thinking about it. But A Little Princess is Sarah Crewe, the main character. Her father's a very wealthy general or captain. Captain Crewe, yes. I was like, it's something. Yeah, on the back, it says he's a captain. And he is killed in battle. And so she becomes an orphan, and the whole book takes place in a girl's home, in an orphanage. So that's another famous orphan we've got. We have another one, Anne of Green Gables. This was a very important book for me growing up. I loved Anne of Green Gables. I read the whole series over and over and over. She's famously an orphan, and the story starts where she is being picked up and adopted by Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, old maid and bachelor brother and sister, old fuddy-duddy couple, I guess you could say, adopt her, and she was supposed to be a boy to help them on their farm, and when he got to the train station, she was a girl, and he just kind of went with it. And she's a really eccentric figure, and she transforms their lives, and shenanigans ensue. So yeah, Anne of Green Gables is another sort of famous orphan. Something that maybe you're seeing, with all of these is that a lot of times in literature there's something sort of angelic about being an orphan, something like, oh, bless their hearts, right? This sort of magical orphan can come along, and they have a heart of gold, and they can change they can melt all the hearts of the adults in the room, right? Oliver Twist was that way, which that's not a children's book, but anyway, it's the same way. Sarah Crew is that way. Dorothy, Ragged Dick, Anna Green Gables. Maybe Tom Sawyer is a little bit different. He's not quite so. He kind of causes heartache for all of the adults in his life, but you just kind of gotta love him, right? So you have this sort of trope of the kid without parents just kind of having this otherworldly pluck that makes they're survivors, right? So I don't know that that's necessarily a healthy depiction, because there are plenty of children who grow up without parents and they're devastated permanently. So I don't know that that's necessarily a very helpful trope to have. So I wanted to point out this is the kind of ways that orphans are being depicted in literature. I have more. James and the Giant Peach. He's famously an orphan, and his Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker adopt him to be basically their servant, and they mistreat him, and he escapes their abuse basically in this Peach, right? And they get their comeuppance. So he's an orphan who his parents were killed by charging rhinos, is the story that he was told, but I think it was like a car accident or something. So James is another famous orphan. I pulled this one from my shelf mainly because the movie just came out this year, The House with a Clock in Its Walls, because it was the movie with Jack Black and Kate Blanchett, and it was really good. It was a really good movie. Way better than I thought it was going to be. Echo loved it. But John Bellairs, he wrote a bunch of different mystery novels, and this was one of them. And the whole thing starts with the main character coming to sort of be taken in by his uncle, who sort of adopts him, right? So he's sort of embarking on his own with being adopted by an eccentric family member, which kind of seems to be a theme. If you've read or seen this series, Molly Moon, are y'all familiar with the Molly Moon? I've got all of them. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. I've got 8 Molly Moons down there in total. They made a movie of this one, The Incredible Book of Hypnotism. There was a movie of this Molly Moon that Echo absolutely loved, so I got the series for us to read. But the whole thing, Molly Moon's an orphan, and it takes place in an orphanage, and it's all the different kids in the orphanage, and sort of the mistreatment that's there and things. So that's a little bit more of a modern example of an orphan. One we already talked about too in the picture book unit is Hugo Cabret. The Invention of Hugo Cabret is the full title of the novel. But Hugo, he lives in the train station in London, and his father, he and his father used to live up in the rafters in the clock, and his dad was the clock winder. Well, his dad passes, and he doesn't tell anybody. Well, his dad never comes home, basically. They assume, I think he either abandoned him or passes on. And so Hugo continues his job because he doesn't want anybody to know that he's living up there by himself. So he is like a homeless orphan in this novel. So that's another more modern example of an orphan. We also have, I don't know if we talked about this in here, this is a Newbery winner, The Graveyard Book. This is Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, who is famous for American Gods and Stardust and Coraline, among others. He wrote The Graveyard Book, which if you haven't read it, it's so good. The Graveyard Book is basically a gothic retelling of The Jungle Book. The characters are pretty much the same. The plot's the same. The chapter titles are even the same. All of the sort of episodes that happen in The Jungle Book happen in The Graveyard Book, except instead of set in India, with a human Indian boy being raised by a panther and a bear and a snake, he is a human boy in, I think, New York, maybe? It's in modern times. I don't remember where, and he's being raised by a vampire and a ghost in a graveyard, like, and he lives in a crypt, and so all of the characters like from the jungle and Jungle Book are supernatural creatures in the graveyard, and he can see them and stuff. So it's very good, but it's an orphan tale. I mean, Jungle Book's another example. Mowgli is an orphan and being raised by the jungle. I didn't even pull that one off the shelf. Another one that recently had a movie, If I Stay. I don't know if you can see that. If I Stay by Gail Foreman, and there's the sequel, Where She Went, which is also very good. But If I Stay is about the girl who's a well-known, like a gifted cellist. She plays the cello. This is me playing a cello. And she's in a car accident with her parents, and her parents are killed, and she's in a coma, and her leg is mangled, and she's in a coma, and the whole book takes place with her sort of spirit wandering around and looking at the aftermath of the accident, and she's deciding if she's gonna stay and go back into her body and live her life, or if she wants to go and pass on, right? So while she's in a coma, so that's why it's called If I Stay. It's so good. But it is about an orphaned teenager, and Where She Went is a few years later, like once she's into young womanhood, and sort of the aftermath of her decision. Spoiler, she stays. And so it's very good. And it's not, you can see it's short. It's not a super long book. It's very, very good if you haven't read it. Another modern famous orphan is Aragon. He lives with his uncle and his cousin. And his uncle is killed pretty early on in the book, toward the beginning. And so he and his cousin are both orphaned at that point. He was an orphan already, but he's fully orphaned when his uncle's killed. And so then he has to set out on his adventure and become, the hero of the story. But he's like a teenager when that happens. So he's an orphan. And then probably, I say the best for last, the most famous orphan of all. Who do you think it's going to be? You can guess. I'll give you a chance. Harry Potter! The most famous orphan that there is in modern children's literature. Harry Potter. It was adopted by his cruel aunt and uncle. That's the theme, obviously. And he's the orphan, but he's the chosen one who has to run off and be the hero, much like Aragon. Not in children's lit. Another example is Luke Skywalker. He's sort of a famous orphan who has to run off and be the hero once his aunt and uncle are killed, and we know who his parents are. So I guess he's not technically an orphan. He thinks he is, but we find out that he's not an orphan because of Darth Vader. But his life has been lived as if he's an orphan. So yeah, I had Harry Potter as the last example. So as you can see, just with my sampling that I have, that sort of this heroic orphan, homeless child character is kind of a trope. It's a trope in children's literature. And again, I think part of that is practical reasons. Like, if there are adults in their lives, how are the children going to emerge as the heroes of the story, right? So the adults have to either be corrupt or absent or ineffectual in some way or dead. That's really your options. So, that's why it's a thing. So, I mean, I don't know if we're talking about representation, we're talking about children who are orphans who are reading this literature. I don't know. I haven't decided if that's a positive depiction or not. If that cliche or that archetype of the heroic orphan is harmful or if it's helpful.
That was me talking to you about characters who are orphans who have no parents in children's literature, and I really enjoyed telling you about them, and I watched it back so I could remember what all I said. So yeah, there's some good stuff in there. I had one more thing to show you, and this is a doll. Some people are creeped out by dolls, I understand. But this is my Anne of Green Gables doll. I talked about Anne of Green Gables in the video and how she's one of my very favorites growing up. So this is my Anne of Green Gables doll. She has her little boots and her hat and her little suitcase that she arrives at the Cuthbert's house with, and her long red braids. Um, and so this doll is very special to me because my dissertation director in graduate school gave me this doll as a present. She said, I know that you will take good care of her and she'll have a good home with you. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was so touched. And so if you've ever been in my office or if you ever come in my office, this doll usually sits up on the shelf, the high bookcase behind my desk in my office. But I took her down and brought her home so I could put her on the video for you guys. So if you're ever in my office at school, you can come by and see her sit in there. If you're a doll person, or if you ever see her up there, you'll know what that is. She's Anne of Green Gables from some of my favorite books growing up. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you're hanging in there for the end of the semester. And as usual, get in touch if you have questions or issues. But until then, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.